And when Carrie approached me about preaching today, I had some trepidation about delivering a sermon on a date that is surely heavy for all of us in our own ways. But the more I thought about it, I found myself reflecting on my relationship to the date with something like interest, or maybe even tenderness. Birthdays and wedding anniversaries will always be celebrated on September 11th. Today is also variously recognized as Racial Justice Sunday, Make Your Bed Day, National Grandparents' Day, and somewhat oddly, National No News is Good News Day. September 11th rightly lives in infamy in our collective consciousness, and it is one of 365 days that all contain both human joy and suffering. When the events of the September 11th occurred 21 years ago, I was exactly 12 time zones ahead of New York City. I was getting ready for bed in Baganur, Mongolia, where I was serving in the Peace Corps. Information was slow and incomplete to reach me through official channels. So much of what I learned came from the Mongolians in my town. All of them were devastated on my behalf. All of them wanted to know if I had friends or family who had perished in the attacks. 2 weeks ago, I was actually visiting New York City with my sister. Walking the streets of Lower Manhattan, I was struck at both the resilience of the toughest city in the world and the human struggle playing out before my eyes. I saw people who were obviously challenged by some combination of poverty, mental illness, homelessness, loneliness, addiction, and the oppressive heat of late summer. My heart broke a little each time I walked past someone sleeping in a doorway, or wandering the subway platform, dazed and disheveled, or half-heartedly asking passersby for spare change. I offered a little to a few, but I could have done more. New York City's population is over 8 million, and I was visiting from across the country. Were the struggling people I met, in the biblical sense, my neighbors? In Mongolia, a country whose entire population is a much smaller 3.2 million, and whose culture is both much older and more homogenous, it was taken for granted by my colleagues that I must be related to someone killed on 9/11. This is a place where nomadic herders will leave their yurts unlocked, just in case a traveler comes by and needs somewhere to crash. My time in Mongolia was basically a 2-year masterclass in thinking of everyone as your neighbor. I've spent decades learning to bear witness to the physical, spiritual, and emotional pain of my fellow humans. As a hospice volunteer, I provided loving presence for dying people and respite for their loved ones. As a crisis counselor, I was trained to open each interaction with an acknowledgement of what the person in crisis was experiencing, which ran the gamut from breakups to bullying to depression and self-harm. And in my current line of work, I all too often have the opportunity to sit with colleagues in the wake of devastating violence. Earlier this year, after the shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde, I was in spaces hosted by our Black and Latino employee groups, where my coworkers shared their despair, frustration, rage, fear, and disbelief at the staggering losses of life. Ironically, a year and a half prior, I was organizing similar spaces in the wake of the murders of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom were people that looked just like me. In each of these situations, the goal is to stay present, to look clearly and with compassion at the pain of the person or persons in front of me, and to say with my silence or with my words, I see you. You're not alone on this earth, and your experience matters to me. And yet I find myself daily falling short of Jesus' example and the ideal that he puts forward in the Good Samaritan fable. The Samaritan saw the dignity and humanity of the robbery victim and acted accordingly. He saw past the dirt and the blood to the person underneath, and at great personal expense, he ensured his security and then his healing. How many times have I walked or driven past someone, often very different from myself in race, socioeconomic status, mental health status, or cleanliness, and failed to respond to what they were really asking for? Like the plowman and the ship in the Auden poem, I see Icarus falling out of the sky and disappearing into the water, but I have somewhere to be and sail calmly on. Or like Robin DiAngelo says, yes, yes, racial discrimination and injustice, but hey, Rainier cherries are on sale. How easily do I allow myself to be distracted away from the state my neighbors are in? How quickly do eyes glaze over at the statistics of people affected by homelessness, gun violence, wildfires? As Bill Gates Sr. said, these numbers are our neighbors. Our collective looking away takes its toll. David Brooks, who writes a conservative opinion column for the New York Times, recently put forward a potential solution to the seemingly endless parade of mass shootings in our country. The answer, he seemed to say, was in noticing the cry for help among lonely, disaffected young men. And let's be honest that this is a problem of young men, and reaching out to them, telling them, you don't have to do this. You don't have to demonstrate your isolation and anger in this way. We'll accept you. Brooks was roundly eviscerated by those who pointed out that disaffected young men could kill far fewer people if our gun laws were stricter, and that the onus should not be on the rest of us to fix the problem. But I do think he has a point. We tend not to see the people we don't want to see. Brooks describes them. No one knows them. They're not necessarily loners. They are failed joiners. It feels shameful to be so unworthy of human attention. As George Bernard Shaw said, the worst sin towards our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them. As someone who has 2 small children myself, I wonder what messages they're getting about who is worthy of my attention, how to work through conflict and deal with setbacks and disappointment and loneliness in a healthy way, and what we value in our society. Someone forwarded me a couple of examples of a social media trend where people pretend to be panhandlers. They go up to strangers in grocery store parking lots, for example, and ask for a small sum of money. All the while, someone is surreptitiously videotaping the encounter. In one such video, the subject approaches a middle-aged woman who not only refuses to give him any money, she berates him and tells him to go find a job. The subject then approaches a younger man who, despite not having much money himself, gives him a few dollars. The subject then reveals that this was basically a test of character and presents the younger man with several $100s as a reward for doing the right thing. The younger man breaks down in tears, apparently overcome with shock and gratitude at this unexpected outcome. But the real zinger about this particular video is that the middle-aged woman who has been observing the goings-on comes back and tries to get some of that money for herself, saying she needs it to buy food for her dog. But the subject refuses, saying that she had her chance and effectively blew it. While I have some conflicting thoughts about this approach to social change, I've also been reflecting that it feels a bit like a modern day parable. It's kind of a blend of the laborers in the field and the 10 virgins stories. I can see Jesus telling this story to his followers. Therefore, keep watch, for ye know not who is really in need and who's recording this to put on their Instagram. But probably best to be kind to both of them, and at the very least, don't be a jerk. Who is my neighbor? All fellow humans. And how do we balance our responsibility with our own self-care? Toni Morrison says, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding. And though it is important not to ignore its pain, it's also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence." There's a sculpture called Dark Elegy, which is a collection of 75 life-sized figures, each one representing a wife or a mother of a victim of the 1988 terrorist attack on Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. The figures portray the women at the exact moment that they heard the news of the death of their loved one. Some are kneeling, others are lying down, or with arms outstretched in shock and horror. The collection of figures was created by one of the victims' mothers, who had already been working as a sculptor for many years and started with one figure and gradually expanded it into a memorial that is now 65 feet in diameter. She says, "Initially, I portrayed myself, not only at that moment of hearing the heartbreaking news, but also in varying positions of grief, rage, and hopelessness. Soon, other mothers and widows asked to participate, each one having lost loved ones on this fateful flight. Although the concept was spawned out of my personal tragedy, it has always been dedicated to all victims of terrorism. This sculpture needs no language. It is understood by all." Today is a day of remembering. Today is a day of bearing witness. May we create our own rituals, remembrances, and markers to honor those we have lost, particularly to violent acts. And may we have the bravery and strength to look at the human face of suffering, to recognize the divine within each of our neighbors, and to refuse to succumb to the malevolence in our world. Amen.